Hello, my name is Tyler Power, and I am currently a UPI student in my final year, and as I record this presentation, the final few weeks of my Bachelor's of Wildlife Conservation. This presentation was done in partial fulfillment of a biology-directed studies course. This presentation will be a summary of the research and work I did on bank swallow habitat selection in Prince Edward Island National Park. So as you can see, this slide just provides a bit of a presentation breakdown. My presentation is split into three main parts. In the first part, we'll discuss background information pertinent to the study that I completed. In part two, we'll kind of talk more about that study, such as the methods and the results. And then in part three, we'll talk about the discussion kind of behind that study, its implications, and any future considerations that might be associated with those findings. So let's go ahead and dive right into part one and learn a bit more about bank swallows. So I feel like it is important to provide a little bit of information about myself and why I wanted to pursue this directed studies project. I first became interested in conservation and ecology in high school. I decided to attend Holland College for 2 years to obtain a diploma in wildlife conservation technology. After a short time away from school, I decided to begin working towards my degree at UPI. Over my time at university and various summer job experience, my curiosity for understanding the natural world and the passion for conservation have grown, eventually leading me to pursue an opportunity to obtain my Master's of Science. I decided that the research experience I would gain from completing a directed studies like this one would be beneficial in helping me secure an opportunity to pursue my Master's of Science. I also felt that having to work on a project like this independently would help improve my understanding of research projects and the organizational and planning skills needed to complete this type of work. A little bit more background here. I feel quite lucky to have been able to have spent the previous summer working for Parks Canada as a summer student in the resource conservation section of the Prince Edward Island National Park Field Unit. It is a really amazing workplace for students interested in gaining invaluable experience in the field. Resource conservation managers encourage all of the students working with the park to pursue projects of personal interest and are given time to develop these projects and work on them throughout the summer. When I approached them with the idea of conjoining this project with a directed study at UPI, they were incredibly supportive and helped me to decide upon doing some sort of study focusing on the bank swallow. The park has been monitoring bank swallow nesting sites since 1995 and as part of their ecological integrity monitoring program since 2005. Due to widespread decline in Canadian bank swallow populations, the species was listed as threatened by COSWIC in May of 2013, making them of special concern in the park. The bank swallow is the smallest member of the Hirnidinidae family in North America, measuring just 12 centimeters in length and 10 to 18 grams in weight. In flight, bank swallows are most easily distinguished from other swallow species by their small size, dark gray breast band, and a flight pattern of quick wing beats. The species displays no sexual dimorphism, so the easiest way to determine male individuals from female individuals is through in-hand identification of brood patches on females or cloacal protuberances on males. Despite their small size, bank swallows have a global distribution and can be found in every continent with the exclusions of Australia and Antarctica. This map provides some context as to where their breeding and wintering habitats are in North America. As you can see, the more northerly areas are the breeding habitats, and the more southerly areas are their wintering habitats. They'll migrate northward, usually to breed. Bank swallows, as you likely could have deduced from their name, use vertical cliffs and banks as their breeding habitat. Globally and within North America, bank swallows use a variety of habitats which offer these features, such as coastlines, lakeshores, river banks, and wetlands. Both cliff and bank habitat are comprised of two parts: the talus, which is the section near the bottom where rocks and other debris accumulate in a pile, and the face, which is the vertical section of the bank found directly above the talus. Both face and talus are maintained by erosional forces of wind and wave action, something we have plenty of along PEI's coasts. The vertical face serves as the host for the excavation of cavities dug by male swallows. Usually these cavities are 50 to 90 centimeters in depth. Once cavities are formed and nesting pairs are solidified, these cavities serve as very suitable homes in which to raise young. The average clutch size for bank swallows in northeastern North America is 5. Bank swallows are colony nesters. Their colonies can consist of 1 to thousands of individual cavities, but often when examining these colonies, there are more cavities than there are actual mating pairs or nesting pairs, because excavation is often abandoned once an obstacle is encountered. The coloniality of bank swallows is believed to be a response not to a shortage of suitable habitat, as large amounts of suitable habitat are often left vacant. Rather, it appears that coloniality serves as a defense against predation, as predators at large colonies are detected more quickly, mobbed in greater numbers, and are subject to more vocal commotion than predators at smaller colonies. Like many other swallow species, bank swallows are aerial insectivores, meaning that they are most commonly seen flying low to the ground and grabbing aerial insects in their beak. This feeding behavior can be seen occurring with a single swallow, pairs of swallows, or even entire flocks. As you can see, flies, ants, wasps, beetles, and bugs make up the majority of their breeding season diet. Now that we've learned a bit more about bank swallow life history and ecology, it's time to address their population concerns. As I previously mentioned, bank swallows have seen widespread decline. According to the Breeding Bird Survey data within Canada, the population declined 98% from 1970 to 2012. Definitely concerning numbers, although more recent data, as you can see, suggests the rate of change is shrinking. In contrast to Canadian Breeding Bird Survey data, the US data shows no significant long-term annual declines and a non-significant increase in the short term. This could mean good things for the Canadian population, as the US population could serve as a source of rescue for the Canadian one. However, when we examine the population trends of the individual border states of the US, which are most closely related to the Canadian border, those states have seen some significant decline over the short term. So this makes the rescue effect less of a possibility and makes the population decline in Canada even more concerning. There are several theories or hypotheses for the decline of bank swallows in Canada and North America. Climate change is believed to be the underlying factor driving quite a few of these theories or hypotheses. I don't have time to explain all of these causes in detail, but I will touch on a few of them that seem to be most likely based on the literature. These are a few of the impacts or factors that are believed to be contributing due to climate change to the decline of bank swallows in northeastern Canada and Canada as a whole. So nearshore ice, erosion control structures, breeding phenology and prey abundance, and the decline of aerial insects. So I'm just going to address breeding phenology and prey abundance. A recent study by Imlay et al. In 2018 found that there is a negative relationship between early insect emergence and breeding success in northeastern bank swallows. By examining maritime volunteer nest records scheme data, they determined that maritime swallow species, excluding bank swallows, have advanced their egg laying by 8 to 10 days over the last 57 years. The shift is likely in response to climate change altering the emergent states of aerial insects. Thus, it appears that bank swallows have failed to adapt to this change. Only bank swallows have seen a negative trend in breeding success in recent years of the 4 maritime swallow species examined in Imlay's studies. These results suggest that a changing insect emergence from climate change is negatively affecting the reproductive success of bank swallows because of their inability to advance their egg laying during the breeding season. There are also other possible factors contributing to the decline of bank swallows that aren't directly related to climate change. Again, in the interest of time, I'll present the one factor which has been recently shown to be likely contributing to bank swallow population decline, but it is important to name these other ones. Habitat loss, mostly due to, at least in Canada and eastern Canada, due to agricultural intensification and continued agricultural expansion. Vehicle collisions, which is an interesting one and kind of a weird behavior that's associated with bank swallows. If you're interested in reading more about that, I definitely recommend it. It's an interesting topic for sure. And then wintering habitat carryover effects, which is the possible threat or factor that I'm going to address in more detail. So, migratory bird species conservation is kind of unique in the sense that it often requires the consideration of habitat quality in two often very different areas. The effects felt by a species in one of their habitats can have an effect on their success in the other. These are called carryover effects. Tara Imlay in 2018 did a study and found that multiple intrinsic markers identifying carryover effects to breeding sites in male northeastern bank swallows. These findings suggest that non-breeding or wintering habitat conditions play a serious role in population decline. So with that, all that background information on life history and ecology and kind of the history of the population's decline in Canada, and some of the possible reasons for that decline. We're now going to go into talking a bit more about my project and the directed studies project and kind of the, I guess, just more the study that we designed to look at a particular aspect of bank swallows on PEI. So as you can see from the title on this slide, I chose, and my supervisor chose to look at habitat selection for bank swallows in their breeding habitat in Prince Edward Island National Park. This idea definitely was not something I came up with all on my very own. It was definitely supported by my supervisors at Parks Canada as well as Dr. Marina Silva Ops. So we thought it would be interesting and a meaningful study to do because, as I did mention, habitat loss is a concern for bank swallows, but it's also just important to understand habitat selection and what it means for a species. Studies that provide information on habitat selection by a species are crucial to justifying the protection of critical habitat and provide information on biological requirements. Through the process of classifying habitat into separate categories from which the animal may select, in this case bank swallows select, it is possible to test hypotheses regarding the selection of habitat by a specific species. Selective use of habitats is usually described as the use of a particular habitat more or less often than would be expected if all types were used randomly and without preference. The information on habitat use by bank swallows is needed to ensure that crucial breeding habitat is prioritized for protection, particularly in the face of the predicted impacts of climate change on Prince Edward Island's coastline, where natural habitat is favored for breeding as opposed to in Western Canada they actually prefer artificial habitats, but that's not really important for this study. So in this presentation, I'll describe the patterns of use for bank swallow cavity nesting within Prince Edward Island National Park, and more specifically, I'll compare swallow use of habitat types to the availability of those habitat types within the park, and identify habitat features consistently occurring in areas used by swallows. So let's talk a bit about the study design, and more specifically the study area. This study was carried out from May to August of 2020 in Prince Edward Island National Park. The province of Prince Edward Island is located in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and is characterized by its red soil and picturesque coastline. Prince Edward Island National Park was established in 1937 and is located on the north shore of the province, covering an area of just 18.2 kilometers squared. Habitat descriptions were classified through walking surveys for much of the PIMP coastline, with the exception of steep sandstone cliffs where there were no beachfronts present. Those locations which could not be surveyed were classified using survey information from previous years and satellite imagery. Through the surveys, shoreline was classified as one of three habitat types: dune, till, or sandstone. Changes in habitat were recorded using a global positioning system, or GPS. These points were then imported into ESRI ArcMap, where polylines were created in order to quantify the amount of each habitat type present in the park. So cavity survey data was collected by completing walking surveys of the shoreline. 2 resource conservation students walked sections of the beach until a nest cavity was identified. If the cavity was a single cavity and not part of a larger colony, only one coordinate was recorded. If the cavity was the beginning of a colony, a start point coordinate was taken. After recording this start point, both students would walk the length of the colony until they reached the last cavity. At this last cavity, students recorded an endpoint coordinate. While walking the length of the colony, both students independently counted the number of cavities found within each colony. These two numbers were then recorded and averaged to get an unbiased number of cavities. In addition to recording the number of cavities in each colony, surveyors also recorded the type of habitat in which the colony was found. So now that I've talked about the data that was collected and how it was collected, it's now important to talk about the analysis of that data. So habitat selection was examined using the Shoreline Habitat Survey data and the Cavity Survey data. These data sets were used to compare the use and availability of habitats within the study area using what is called the new method. The new method uses a chi-squared goodness of fit test. This method has been used extensively to compare observed usages to that which would be expected if habitats were used in proportion to their availability. The method requires the calculation of confidence intervals, or Bonferroni Z statistics, around the expected proportions to determine if the observed number are significantly different than the expected. Expected usage of each of the habitats is defined as the ratio of each individual habitat to the total area of the study site. Habitat availability was defined as the total amount of each habitat type present within the study area. The study area was defined as the entire northern coastline of the national park, with the exclusion of estuaries because these aren't really suitable habitats for building cavities or colonies for bank swallows. Usage was then defined as the total number of cavities found within each of the defined habitat types. This corresponds with the Design 1 analysis of habitat selection because usage and availability were examined at the population level rather than the individual levels. So now we're into the results of the study and the results of our analysis and surveys. Let's start off with the habitat surveys. Habitat surveys showed that dune made up the largest proportion of Prince Edward Island National Park's coastal habitat at 67% of the total available habitat. Till and sandstone made up a much smaller proportion at 13% and 20% respectively. In total, surveys yielded that 47.43 kilometers of nesting habitat along Prince Edward Island National Park's shoreline were available for bank swallow breeding. Cavity and colony surveys were a highlight of the summer for me because they allowed me to see bank swallows pretty up close and personal, and interacting with each other as well. Till was definitely fairly heavily occupied by bank swallows. The single largest breeding colony was located within Till, as well as the largest number of cavities in total at 132. Dune had the second largest number of cavities at 76, followed by Sandstone at 40. The results of our new method analysis yielded some pretty interesting findings. We were able to compare the expected proportion of use with that which was actually observed. Based on this analysis, we were able to determine that despite till making up the smallest proportion of total habitat available, it contained the largest proportion of cavities observed. This showed that till was being selected for. This analysis also showed that sandstone and dune were avoided, showing a degree of avoidance for this habitat. So these buffer ring analysis, I didn't really touch on it during the methods portion of the presentation, but that was because they're a little bit of a later edition, and I didn't really have the time to do the research on buffering analysis in the literature that I would have liked to. But that being said, I'll definitely still try to explain or present what I think can be deducted from this analysis. Buffering analysis usually consists of rings placed at different spatial lengths from a certain point. And it can be used to kind of look at what habitat features might be in a certain landscape surrounding a point of interest. For our analysis, we place them at 50, 100, and 200 meters from the center point of a few of the cavities that we were able to have the coordinates for. So this is an example of the buffer rings that we made. I'm going to scroll through a few slides here, and they'll show you these buffer ring maps that I've created using QGIS for quite a few of the different colonies that were recorded during the surveys. What I hope you're paying attention to when I go through these slides is just kind of the general habitat that's surrounding the buffer rings or is within the buffer rings, but to also pay attention outside of the buffer rings because it gives you a good idea of the landscape characteristics of the sites that bank swallows might be selecting for creating their colonies. I apologize for these last couple of maps, as for some reason the base layer kept switching back to this winter satellite imagery, so it looks a bit mixed up. But those large blank white areas that you can see here are just agricultural fields. So yeah. After looking at these results, as is usually customary for any study, we're going to do a bit of a discussion and also going to talk about some future considerations for studies regarding bank swallows in northeastern Canada, but also within PI National Park. With these results, probably asking the question, what does it all mean? Well, to simply look at our analysis, it would mean that bank swallows are selecting till as their preferred habitat, and that the amount of habitat really isn't determining the factor for colony or cavity site selection. This idea is something that is supported by other studies regarding bank swallow habitats and the selection of those habitats. Despite this seemingly strong selection for till habitat, it may not actually be the substrate makeup of till that made its sites so desirable for bank swallows. Another study which addressed the topics surrounding the coloniality of bank swallows found that larger bank swallow colonies were actually positively correlated to habitats that have some of the following characteristics: taller or more vertical or steeper slope. The habitat was made up of sands and fine gravel, was more often excavated by a river, which doesn't necessarily pertain to coastal habitat, but similar erosional forces are produced by coastal waves and wind erosion. And that larger colonies also were clear of any vegetation that might have interfered with the flying space in front of the face of the colony. So perhaps the location of the largest colonies or all cavities found during the surveys were more influenced by these types of characteristics than the actual substrate. With those factors in mind, we can also consider some other things that could contribute to selection. Saldenha 2016 addressed many of the questions surrounding the use of foraging and roosting habitat in northeastern bank swallows. In their paper, they suggested that the proximity of foraging habitat may actually play a role in the selection of habitat for colony formation. Something that seems very plausible given the benefits of close foraging habitat, benefits which include reduced energetic cost and the reduced energetic risk of predation associated with traveling, and additionally increased time for behaviors associated with caring for young. This theory is supported by our buffer ring analysis, although it likely would be easier to see had rings been extended to the 2-kilometer mark, which was like the average maximum distance bank swallows traveled for foraging in the Saldenha 2016 paper. Despite this, the buffer ring maps still allow us to look at habitats adjacent to colony sites, and through doing this, we can see that all examined colony sites were within 2 kilometers of freshwater foraging habitats, or within agricultural fields, which are also prime foraging areas, historically and presently, I guess, for bank swallows. So, like every study, this one definitely has some sources of error. So human error is obviously always going to be an issue with doing surveys, particularly with site surveys. So the counting of cavities, which were not active, could have contributed to an overall higher count or an inaccurate high count of how many cavities were located within colonies. And during these surveys, it's also quite possible that someone could have, or both surveyors could have missed cavities that were active. And then one other thing I think I would have liked to look into more is whether the new method is the best way to measure habitat selection for colony nesting species, because it's not really something I read in the literature had been used for colony nesting species. It was more something I saw looked at for individual species use for different habitats. So it would be interesting to maybe look at some different methods of analyzing habitat selection. Future considerations. So these are future research focuses. So just to look at a few here. Is there a statistical significant correlation between habitat selected for colony formation and proximity to foraging and roosting habitat, which was something we kind of discussed in the discussion, but I do think it's a valid research question, and I'd be interested specifically in Prince Edward Island National Park because of kind of understanding that we need to place a focus on protecting not just where they're creating their colonies, but also where they're going to be foraging and possibly where they're going to be roosting. And is bank swallow reproductive success being influenced by climate change? So is changing temperatures negatively impacting nestling mortality, which is something that was discussed with some of my Parks Canada colleagues and managers. So that would be pretty involved and would probably require a lot more permits than was something that I could have ever addressed with this study. But also I think it would be interesting to look at what determines the distance between cavities in a colony, just out of curiosity. I think that could be interesting to look at, as it may contribute to the size of colonies and how close they are together, or kind of just the general availability of habitat overall. So that pretty much wraps it up for the main part of this presentation. Without taking up too much more time, I just wanted to address some of the personal lessons I felt I learned during this directed studies course and doing my field work during the previous summer for Parks Canada. So one is definitely the importance of a clear goal, knowing what you want to measure, why you want to measure, or why you want to measure it, and how you're going to measure it. I think at times I wasn't 100% sure, or should have been more prepared or certain in what I wanted to measure, and also the statistical method I wanted to measure it with. Also, definitely learned about organizational skills. I think it's something that is obviously super important, but will probably only become more important as you work with larger and larger data sets. So my data set wasn't massive, but it definitely would have helped to have been more organized, even with its relatively small size. So yeah, those are just some of the lessons that I learned while doing this. And just one more quick slide, just to say thank you for listening, and that I hope you learned a few things about bank swallows from this presentation. I know I learned a lot going through this entire course and even creating this presentation. I would also like to take a second to thank the entire Parks Canada resource conservation team, especially my supervisor Haley and PI's resident GIS expert, or PEI National Parks resident GIS expert Paul, and the other summer staff who helped me to make some very long walks on some very hot days. I would also like to thank my supervisor Marina for her help and support with this project, as well as Dr. Kevin Tether for approving this project and thus supporting me in my goal of gaining more research experience. Thank you, everyone.